So I am so happy to be introducing Andy to everyone today. As mentioned, he's the author of The Martian, but also the just published, as of today, Artemis. Very exciting. I hear it's pretty good. Please buy a copy. You may also know Andy describes himself as a lifelong space nerd and a devoted hobbyist of subjects like relativistic physics, orbital mechanics, and the history of manned space flight. And I knew that was true the very first time I talked to him, way back when The Martian was just a manuscript on my desk. And Andy started telling me how, just for fun, he'd created his own programs to calculate all the Earth-Mars launch windows in the book, or like the exact amount of thrust you would get from venting atmosphere through an airlock. And I suspect, actually, I know, he wrote Artemis mainly as an excuse to design his own personal lunar colony. So, I also suspect that Andy's sheer enthusiasm for the science of it all is one of his biggest superpowers as a writer. He manages to capture that joy in figuring stuff out and bottle it on the page in a way that is irresistible and infectious. And that's one reason why he's a perfect person to be talking to you all today. So please join me in welcoming Andy.
Thank you, Julian. Woo! All right, I can do this. Yes, so let me make sure I'm not the jerk here. Okay, airplane mode, good. Well, usually what I talk about is kind of my extremely improbable and bizarre path to success. Basically, I always wanted to be a writer ever since I was a little kid. I think the first stuff that I wrote was Henry and Ribsy fan fiction when I was about, like 10 years old. No, I was younger. It must have been about 8 years old. So, you know, the old Beverly Cleary books with Henry Higgins, and yeah. So I wrote fan fiction on that. That was some of the first stuff I wrote. And I always wanted to be a writer. But as time went by, I would write, really crappy short stories when I was a teenager, and had a lot of fun with it. And eventually I got to be 18, and it was time to, actually choose. I'm going to college, and it's time to pick, a major. And I wanted to be a writer, but I also like regular meals. And I don't find refrigerator boxes to be a rewarding place to live. And so I decided, all right, I'm going to go into computer programming. It was the late 80s. It was a kind of a new career path that was opening up for people. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go to college and get a degree in software. So I went to college, and I did what my Gen X generation kind of famous for, is going to college and not finishing. I ran out of money, and so I eventually saw that, the whole tech industry was starting to take off. Now we're into the kind of early 90s. And the tech industry was really starting to take off, and I'm like, I could go deeply into debt by remaining in college, or I could go into the workforce and get paid to do it. I do regret not finishing off my degree, but I really didn't have a choice. I just didn't have the money. So I went into the tech world, and I really like computer programming. It's fun. It's a thing that I over time got good at, because if you do anything long enough, you eventually start to get good at it. And I enjoyed it. I like that sort of technical thinking and problem solving and stuff like that. And I bounced around from job to job, because that's something you pretty much have to do in the tech industry. If you stay at one job for about 3 years, you start to become an old hand there. I'm not kidding. It's like, I think it's because your value as a computer programmer goes up way faster than any company is ever willing to give raises. So like a computer programmer with 5 years of experience is worth like twice as much as a computer programmer who's fresh out of college, literally. And so no company's going to give you a 100% raise over the course of 5 years. So the only way you manage your salary is to just keep jumping ship and changing jobs. Anyway, right around 1999, I was working for America Online. Long time ago, huh? And I got laid off when they merged with Netscape. Yes, long time ago. And side note, in the middle there, in the mid 90s, I don't know if any of you are video gamers, but I was actually one of the programmers on Warcraft 2. Yeah, I know. That was 1995. Yeah. Please don't do the math on that. It's a long time ago. Anyway, in 99, I was working for America Online. And I got laid off, and I saw that I had a bunch of stock options. And so I'm like, oh, I should probably sell these, because if I had something like 30 days or 60 days to use them or lose them. And so I sold them, and it gave me a nice little nest egg. I realized I could go for years without having to get another job. So I'm like, aha, here's my opportunity. Now I'm going to become a writer. So I had enough money that I could take time off. I took a sabbatical, which is a nice way of saying I was unemployed and didn't bother looking for another job. And I wrote a book. And that book was not The Martian. You've never seen it because it sucks. Julian's seen it. He didn't want to publish it. Like, even after The Martian, you know, it's on the bestseller list. Julian's like, yeah, no, not this one, though. Yeah. But I learned a lot in that process. And during that time, I went through the standard tale of woe that every author has to experience, which is, you know, couldn't get an agent, couldn't get interest from any publishers, just, you know, no traction. And after 3 years, I eventually said, like, well, okay, I did my thing, I gave it a shot, I don't have to wonder what might have been, I'm gonna go back into software engineering. And this wasn't a sad Charlie Brown music, hang your head thing for me. I like programming computers. I'm good at it, and I enjoy that process. So I got back into the tech industry, got back to work, and I said, like, oh, I'm gonna write as a hobby. And around this time, the newfangled internet thingy was starting to ramp up, and I realized, oh, I can just make a website, and I can put creative work there. I made a webcomic, I wrote short stories, and I also made serials. And I started writing The Martian just as a serial on that website in 2009, is when I posted the first chapter. And I would make a new chapter about every 6 to 8 weeks, and I posted it up there. And I had a mailing list for people who could, you know, you just sign up for my mailing list, and I'll email you when I post a new something, whatever. I didn't always post chapters of The Martian. Sometimes it'd be a short story. Sometimes it'd be, you know, some other serial I was working on. I was also writing Sherlock Holmes fan fiction, and I'd post that. And so, you know, kind of whatever I wanted. But I was getting a lot of good positive feedback on The Martian. Now, I had about 3,000 people on my mailing list, which I'd accumulated over 10 years of writing, and most of them were hardcore dorks, such as myself. And so, to me, it was really important to get the science accurate in The Martian because I knew they'd call me out if I was wrong. And so I put a lot of effort into making the science right, and I still failed anyway in certain areas. So it was nice to have these 3,000 fact checkers, because there's nothing a nerd loves more than finding an error in a book. It's like, dear sir. I mean, it's awesome. By the way, and the reason I know this is I am that guy, right? So I am that guy. I'm like, yeah, have you ever noticed that in, you know, Back to the Future, right? They go, in Back to the Future 2, Biff takes the DeLorean back in time and changes the timeline, then brings it back forward in time to 2015, and then Doc and Marty use it to go back. But wait, he changed the timeline back in 1955. Doc and Marty should have been in an alternate timeline. So how did they get back? Yeah, Zuckerberg. Anyway. Chewbacca is a Wookiee. So anyway. And so I really put a lot of effort into making things as scientifically accurate as possible. And bit by bit, I accumulated readers, people really liked it, and eventually I finished. And I'm like, okay, I'm done. Now I'm gonna work on other serials. And I started to get emails from people saying like, hey Andy, I really like The Martian, but I hate your website, which was fair. My website is this total ghetto, I mean, it was just white background with blue hyperlinks that are left justified. Like nothing else, no decor, nothing. And it's like, you click link, you get text wall, enjoy. Nothing beyond that. And so it's understandable, this was not a pleasant visual experience for them. And they said, so can you make an e-reader version of some kind so I can just download it and put it on my e-reader and then I can get it that way? And so I'm like, okay, and I figured out how to do that. It wasn't hard, and I'm like, there you go, folks. Here's an EPUB and a Mobi version, and you can download it. So then I started to get email from other people saying like, hey, Andy, love your story, hate your site. And I see that there's an e-reader version, but I'm not very technically savvy. And I don't know how to download a thing from the internet and put it on my e-reader. Can you just put it up on Amazon so that I can get it through their system? So I'm like, okay, and I figured out how to do that. And they make you charge at least 99 cents for it. You're not allowed to give it away for free, which is what I wanted to do. So I set the price at 99 cents, and then I'm like, okay, there you go. And then they hang on to it for a while to have a human look at it, just to make sure you didn't post a bunch of goat porn or something. And, well, don't judge. And then then it goes live, and I'm like, okay, everybody, now you can read it for free on my website, or download the e-reader version for free from my website, or you can pay Amazon $1 to put it on your Kindle for you. And people bought it. Partially, I think, because the price point was low, but also it got a really nice word-of-mouth campaign. Also, all my fans, my regular readers, just went out and bought it on principle. Like, they're like, I want to give Andy $1. Or actually, for me, I was pulling down a cool 33 cents a copy or something like that. Big money, yeah. And it started selling better and better and better. And then, it got up into the top of the sci-fi sellers, the top of the sci-fi list, best-selling sci-fi on Kindle. And then I got approached by my agent, who's lurking there, yeah, that guy. He emailed and said like, oh, hey, do you have an agent? Because I think this book is pretty good. And I'm like, no. And he's like, well, would you like one? So then I looked him up to make sure he's like a real person and not a scammer or something like that. And he was a real person. And so I said like, sure, you're my agent. And he almost immediately came back with basically Crown was interested in a print deal. And I'm like, well, that sounds good. And so they started negotiating on that. And also right around the same time, Fox, 20th Century Fox, came to me for the movie rights. And I'm like, okay, sure, talk to my agent. And he anyway, the movie rights deal and the book deal were being negotiated at the same time, and they both came together like 4 days apart. That was a stressful week for me. By the way, at this time, I'm still a computer programmer, right? And so I was still like, I'm in my cubicle fixing bugs, and then running off to take a call about my movie deal, and then back to fixing bugs. It was very surreal. And you guys kind of know the rest, especially those of you who are at PRH, is that the book came out, it did very well. It got up to number 2 on the bestseller list for a while because Gone Girl was in theaters, and so the Gone Girl novel, which is also PRH, so they were doing great. And then eventually it got up to number 1, and then the movie got made, and that did extremely well. Yeah, that was an interesting story in that. They had Drew Goddard signed on to write the screenplay adaptation and direct it. And then he wrote a fantastic screenplay, and then he said, oh, I'm going to go off and direct Spider-Man now. And so we had no director. And so the Ridley Scott said, well, I'll direct it. And the studio said, well, okay, that sounds good. And Matt Damon said, I'll play the lead. And then they're like, okay, now this is a real project. And it's like this dream project. It's like this whole sequence of events in my life is just something that you fantasize about, but you never imagine actually happening. It's the sort of like daydream that it's just like, how can this actually be true? But it is true. And one funny thing is like, when I was doing the book deal, when we were doing the book deal, these were all just like voices on a phone or emails. I had never met Julian. I'd never personally met David. And I'm like, is this a scam? Like, is this some sort of scam? I mean, these people are telling me, oh yeah, we're gonna make all our dreams come true. Yeah. And I'm like, is it a scam? At some point, are they gonna, whatever. And it started, and I was suspicious of that. I was looking them up online and finding their, pictures and confirming that, trying to confirm identities. And then eventually when the actual contract came through, the negotiated contract, and David's like, okay, sign this and send it off to Random House. It's like, send this to 1745 Broadway. And I'm like, well, that seems like a sort of place Random House would be, And then when the checks came, then I was like, oh, okay, well, if they're scamming me, they're bad at it. So, yeah, that's kind of my story there. On the Scholastic, classroom edition, sorry. On the classroom edition, I almost immediately started getting emails from teachers at schools all over the country saying like, hey, you know, the Martian would actually be a really useful teaching tool because it gets the kids interested, and I can, you know, it's basically a long series of word problems, right? And they said like, but you know, the language is not super. And some school districts, it's funny, it's like different places. Some school districts are like, yeah, we use the Martian. Yeah, there's swear words, we don't care. Other school districts are like, I don't know, you know. And so they all have their own rules. And so that's when I started, I poked at Random House and asked them, or Crown, and asked them, hey, what about a classroom edition? And they said, like, well, yes, but the problem is we don't want to split the sales between two different versions of the book when we're at the height of our sales. And it also creates brand confusion. Like, you know, this one bookstore accidentally orders 400 copies of the wrong version, and they get mad. So they waited a little bit until things had calmed down, and then they made the classroom edition. So it worked out really well. I'm really happy with how it turned out. And although it is too bad that my really famous opening line just became, I'm pretty much screwed. Anyway, I'm about to turn it over to questions. But before I do, I will pre-answer the first question that I always get. And that question is, how much did you have to do with the making of the movie? And the answer is very little. My main job was to cash the check. And I feel like I did that very well. I had absolutely no authority or say over any part of the movie production. I was, you know, they like, we bought the rights, have a nice day. But that's all they had to do. But they chose to involve me. So that was really nice. Drew, when Drew was writing the screenplay adaptation, he was on the phone with me almost every day, mostly with technical questions. And then during production, occasionally Ridley would or through multiple intermediaries, Ridley would send me a question that I would then send the answer back up the line. And those were always technical. It's not like Ridley Scott needs my creative advice. And so, yeah, that's pretty much what I did in the film. I did not visit the set because they shot it all in Budapest and Jordan, and I'm afraid to fly. I have a pretty significant fear of flying. Also, I live in California, and I'm speaking to you here in Manhattan. How'd I get here? Valium. Cool, how are we on time? We're good. Okay, so I will open it up to questions now. Anybody? Yes?
I want to hear about the first story that you wrote when you took this bet.
Oh, that was called Theft of Pride. It's actually not a bet. Okay, so Theft of Pride is a decent story concept, I think. It's just very badly executed. I hadn't put in my 10,000 hours, so to speak, of learning. But it's actually the second book I wrote. The first book I wrote I did when I was in college, and that's horrible. But Theft of Pride was like a science fiction, a science fiction crime novel. But it's completely completely different story. But it was like about a high stakes jewel theft in the distant future. And I guess the main problem with it was it's just the narration was just so choppy. I mean, I would have to write it over again from scratch if I wanted to revisit it. And I've got a bunch of better ideas for stories now that I'd rather work on. Other questions? We had one question from all of you. Great. Hey! So tell us, what's your name?
Rachel.
Oh, hey, where are you from, Rachel?
So I have a question.
Yeah.
For other kids that are interested in science and engineering, but also writing, your path is a little bit unconventional. But what advice would you give them about trying to hone that skill?
Sure. I mean, you know, what advice do I give for writers in general? I mean, in terms of people who want to make scientifically accurate stories, well, the only difference is do the research, right? Just actually go find out how things work. And that can be hard, but it's easy for me because I love that stuff, but I'm a dork, right? So In terms of writing in general, though, my advice is always, number one, you have to actually write. I'm sure you know all this, but number one, you have to actually write. You can't just sit there and daydream about what the story's going to be. You have to actually put words down on the page. Anything else up until that point is just, you're not writing. You're daydreaming, you're conceptualizing, you're planning, you're plotting, but you're not actually writing. When you start actually, putting words on a page, that's when you find the problems. That's when you realize, oh crap, I don't really have the ability to exposition that carefully thought out 5,000 years of history of this medieval realm I came up with. How do I do this? That's where you start coming up with the problems. That's number one. And number two, here's the hardest part. Resist the urge to tell your story to your friends and family. Weird, huh? Especially if it's good. Because if it's good, they'll be like, ooh, ooh, oh, and then what happens? And they'll be interested. Thing is, most writers, not all, but most, are driven by a desire to have an audience. They're driven by a desire for other people to experience the story that they've come up with. And when you tell people your story verbally, it satisfies that need within you, and it saps your desire to actually write it. It reduces your motivation. So if you make yourself one rule, if you say, the only way anybody experiences a story is by reading it, even my closest friends, only by reading it, then that will greatly improve your motivation to write. Nir, yeah, you, sir.
You portrayed a very interesting view of NASA, at times unflattering, and at times showed some brilliant people there. Did you get any response from people at NASA?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, NASA loved the book. And in fact, the people at NASA thought that, there were people at NASA thought that certain characters were supposed to be specific folks at NASA. They weren't, but they thought they were. What's funny is I got, one bit of feedback I got from the NASA folks was the most unrealistic part of the book was the high level of cooperation shown between NASA and JPL. And somebody back there had a question? Yeah.
Well, you said that you wouldn't share it with friends and family after writing it, but how do you get feedback?
Well,
Where's that coming from?
you give them the parts that you've written. Like you write a chapter and feel free to share that with your friends and family, but don't just tell it to them verbally. Or that's my advice. I mean, I'm not your boss. Yeah.
Did you feel to any degree that the adjustment of the language in the classroom edition compromised your authenticity of the story?
No, I don't think softening the language affected the story. And kind of proof of that is the fact that the movie was PG and it did extremely well, right? The language in there is just for flavor and humor value. I think it made the book a little bit less funny, but it still had all the same things. So themes, I mean. So I don't think it hurt it. Yeah. Let's not always see the same hands. Oh, the other hand, nicely done. Well played.
What would you like students to take away from reading your book? I mean, other than the movie, your book.
Well, I mean, it's funny because I never really have any objective or motivation when I'm writing a story other than to entertain. So I guess I'd just like them to enjoy it. Although, I mean, in the case of STEM, of course, I would like them to become more interested in these problems and to understand that, dry numbers can be boring, but if you give them like an excuse why they care about solving the problem, then they're more likely. I mean, I'm talking to a bunch of teachers. You guys all, you know this, right? But maybe if it makes the kids a little more interested in seeing how math solves real world problems, the connection between science and reality as opposed to hypotheticals, maybe that'd be nice. Anybody else? Oh, from my editor.
Two-part question. First part, what was the moment, do you remember a moment that sort of started your fascination with space flight? And second part is, how did you learn so much about it?
Well, I think, I can't remember a time when I wasn't interested in space. Part of it is because my father is a total space dork. My dad he's retired now, was a particle physicist. Well, actually an accelerator physicist, but the distinction doesn't matter. And my mother was an electrical engineer. Although for Mom, that was a job. She did that for pay. She wasn't passionate about it. And once she retired, she never looked back. She was always much more about reading and literature than science and math. So I guess I got that kind of mixture. Also, my dad had this bookshelf about 6 feet high, 3 feet wide, and a foot deep, jam-packed full of like sci-fi books that he'd accumulated over his life. The man's never thrown away a book. And that's what I read growing up, was these like juveniles, these sci-fi stories from the 50s and 60s and early 70s that Dad had accumulated. So interestingly, like I grew up reading science fiction from the baby boomer era, even though I'm like Gen X. So my holy trinity are like Asimov, Heinlein, and Clarke. So those are the authors that kind of defined for me what science fiction really is. It was a two-parter. What was the other part?
How do you become such an expert in
Oh,
space?
how did I become an expert? Well, I wouldn't say I'm an expert. I would say I'm an enthusiast. And everybody's got hobbies. Everybody has interests, stuff outside of their work that they do. Some people like gardening. Some people are gearheads and they love cars and stuff like that. Well, for me, it's space. So everybody is bizarrely knowledgeable about their hobbies. You'll find some guy, he's like I don't know, he's an accountant somewhere, but he can tell you the entire history of the Mets. Like every player who's ever played any position, stuff like that. People get really into their hobbies and passions. And for me, space travel and spaceflight is that. Yeah?
I understand in the new book, Artemis, that the lead character is a 20-year-old female, and I'm wondering if our students may be able to relate to her more so than Whitney.
Yeah, Artemis, which releases today, available from Crown Publishing. Yeah, the main character is a 26-year-old woman originally from Saudi Arabia, but she grew up on the moon. So culturally, she's like Artemisian. The city is called Artemis, that's why. Let me put it this way. I would hope your students don't identify with her too much, because she's a pretty flawed person. She makes bad decisions. She has regrets. As they do, you would not want your students to like follow her life path. Let's just say, Mark Watney is based on the idealized version of me. He's what I wish I were. He has all the qualities in myself that I like, and none of my many flaws. Jazz is more like the real me. Jasmine Bashara. She's got all the kind of failings that I have. Extremely intelligent. Doesn't always make the extremely intelligent decision. Regrets, kind of like wasted potential, that sort of thing. They might identify with her, but you certainly wouldn't want them following along with her. Yeah.
So as an author, how might you envision science teachers in particular, using a book like The Martian in classrooms?
Well, that's an interesting thing. I've had teachers send me like lesson plans and curricula that they've come up with for The Martian. It's really interesting. Generally, what they do is they just say like, okay, it's basically you have math teachers assigning reading to their students, and they say, all right, read this section, then stop here, and then here's the problem that Mark is facing. He has this much of this and this much of that, and he needs to make it last. And like how long till he runs out of food? Calculate that. And that's like an algebra level question, and so on. So they basically just use it as an excuse to get the word problems in.
How would you envision them doing it differently?
Oh, how would I envision them doing it differently? I don't really know, because I'm not. Teaching is not one of my skills. I don't.
You're a writer and we're not.
Oh, well, yeah, I honestly don't know. I guess I would probably condense it into like a series of like, I guess I'd try to make like a chapter in a math book that has like really, really curtailed, condensed versions of what happened. Oh, you want to get that? Oh, okay. I try to make really like, kind of condensed versions of like, astronaut Mark Watney is having this problem, blah, 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 blah. And then they answer that question. And then question 2 might be a follow-on. It's like, well, now that he's solved that problem, now he has this problem. And of course, you have to make sure that question 2 doesn't rely on the answer to question 1. Otherwise, they just have this cascade failure across all this. But I guess that's what I do. I don't know, you're shoving me out of my comfort zone. I don't know how to teach. Yes.
So I have a 3-part question. Were you ever on set, or did you ever meet the actors or actresses from the movie?
I was never on set. I was unwilling to fly to Budapest. I have met all the cast of The Martian many times because during the whole marketing push for the film, there were all these events and stuff that we ended up going to together. So I did meet, and I went to the premiere. And so, yeah, I got to meet everybody.
How did it feel seeing your book come to life in a movie?
Oh, it's really difficult to describe that. Everybody asks that, of course, but like the first time I saw a cut of the film was Fox brought me in to like one of their viewing little, viewing rooms where they have like 20 seats set up and they project the thing, and the special effects weren't even in the film yet, so it's just there's some there sometimes people walking around in front of green screens, or you can see the wires holding people up and stuff, but still, I tell you, when it started up and it just brought up the title placard that said like The Martian, I cried. Yeah, I mean, it's like, wow.
And do you have a role in the transition from book to movie, like as far as writing the script or anything?
Nope. I had no say whatsoever. Yeah.
So you would say you really focused on making the science accurate in your books.
Uh-huh.
So how important do you think that is? Does that affect your enjoyment of reading a science fiction book or watching a movie?
Well, it definitely
Or do you find it,
affects.
like, a little bit critical?
Well, it definitely affects me because I'm a pedantic little turd. But for most people, it's not that important. The main thing, actually, what's funny is for me, I don't need scientific accuracy, I need scientific consistency. So for me to enjoy a science fiction story, it's like, okay, you got warp drive, fine. You can go faster than light, sure, no problem. You've got this magic. Well, I'm not even gonna argue about it. It's fine, but you have to be consistent. So like in Star Trek, the Enterprise can go like up to warp 9, and in one episode they had to go from Mercury to Earth, and it took them a long time. And I'm like, if you can go the speed of light, it'll take 8 minutes, right? So no, filled with rage, and and other things like if you invent something, if you demonstrate a technology in a story, you have to assume that everybody who lives in that setting would try to figure out all the best ways to use it. And when they don't do that, that drives me crazy. So like in the recent Star Trek movies, they beamed someone directly from Earth to the Klingon homeworld. And I'm like, well, then you no longer need a fleet. I mean, if I can transport stuff directly to the Klingon homeworld, then why do you need ships to go the long way? So you just got to be careful with this stuff. It's okay to break the rules. You just need to break them consistently. Yeah.
So you wrote The Martian as a serial.
Yep.
So you wrote The Martian as a serial, and you wrote Artemis back to front. Is that my understanding?
Yeah, I wrote Artemis just in a traditional contract with Crown. Yeah.
How do you think that affected Artemis?
Well, I mean, of course, I didn't have the chapter-by-chapter feedback from lots and lots of fans, but I did send it to, like, Julian and David and got their feedback and stuff. So I did get iterative feedback, and that's really important to me to know, because I don't want to just work in a vacuum and go off on bad directions without anybody telling me. But yeah, I kind of missed having the, one thing is, with The Martian, every time I posted a chapter, I get like, a couple of hundred emails going, that's awesome, and that's really motivating. It really motivates you. to know there are all these people who are eagerly awaiting the next chapter. And it's not like an entire book away. It's just like, all I have to do is write this one chapter and I get more external validation that I crave. And so, yeah, it was a very different experience. But a good one too, because like Artemis, I had like, one plot line idea, didn't really work out. There were I made many more changes to Artemis, in fact, going back, retroactive changes and stuff like that than I did in The Martian. So if Artemis had been a serial, I would have been kind of locked into these earlier bad decisions that I would have had to work around in the later chapters. But thankfully I didn't have to do that because it all came out in a single unit. Listen, teacher's pet. Yeah. That's right. You just give me your phone, that's an Apple.
Sorry. I'm hearing you go back and forth between the book version and the online version. How much of the online version was not in the book version?
Oh, well, so so the version I wrote and then the changes made once Crown picked it up and we went through editing passes. Very, very small changes, in my opinion. It was a pretty quick and painless, in retrospect, it feels painless. You have to talk to Julian to, but there weren't much changes, and a lot of it was shoe leather stuff, like just, or not even just shoe leather, but more like, just like, Julian would be like, okay, Andy, this scene is good, but you just jump right in with people talking to each other. I don't even know where they are. Like, you just give me a paragraph at the top here that sets the scene of, like, are they in a conference room? Are they in a car? Yeah, I don't know, So it was fairly minor stuff like that. It was a very smooth process, I think. Or it felt that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would you say you had to edit it many times then?
Are we talking about The Martian?
Yeah, The Martian.
So when I was doing it on my own, I would go through, every time I'd make a chapter, I would do several editing passes before posting it online. So I had done a bunch of my own editing by the time I quote-unquote finished. But then, of course, we went through, the editing process once Crown acquired it. But that only took like a couple of weeks. It was not a huge, long process. Or, I don't know, is that a long time? Was it more than that? Julian says it was more than that. I choose to remember it my way. Where are we? Oh, there we are.
Just wondering, like, what percentage would you say is realistic, like what could really happen versus fantasy?
What percent could really happen? Almost all of it. There are a couple of scientific inaccuracies in there. Some are accidental and some were deliberate. The main thing, the biggest error, and this was on purpose, is that in reality, a windstorm on Mars would not have enough force to do, well, anything. It would barely be able to knock over a piece of paper, because Mars does get winds that are like 150 kilometers an hour, but the atmosphere is so thin that wind speed doesn't have a lot of momentum behind it. So that's all just BS. That couldn't happen. And I did have another beginning in mind where it would have been accurate. They were going to do an MAV engine test that goes wrong, and then they're leaking fuel and they need to launch and stuff like that. But it's a human versus nature story, and I wanted nature to get the first punch in. Another thing that was wrong was radiation. On Mars doesn't have a magnetic field, and the atmosphere is extremely thin. There's a lot of radiation out in space, omnidirectional too, not just from the sun, but also just from all directions from the galaxy. So Mark would have been pretty severely irradiated. So what I said was, I just said, oh, Hab canvas is radiation shielded. But there's no such thing. It's just this thin, flexible stuff that will protect you from radiation. Actually, radiation is a huge problem that NASA still has to work on and deal with. The Apollo astronauts left Earth's magnetic field for brief times, like days, to go to the moon and back, and they got like cataracts, which is like, and a host of other problems, and a higher incidence of cancer later in life. So radiation is a really serious issue in space. And then I think there were a few accidental errors in there, but I can't remember them off the top of my head. Oh, wait, I got one. When I wrote The Martian, the Curiosity probe had not landed on Mars yet. And so when I wrote The Martian, the prevailing belief and opinion was that Mars was pretty much arid. There's some water up at the poles, but the ground was like completely dry. And then Curiosity landed after I wrote the book and picked up a scoop of dirt and went like, wow, there's a whole lot of water ice in this. It's so much, in fact, that for every cubic meter of Martian soil, there's 35 liters of water in it. So all that stuff Mark did to make water, he could have just brought in dirt and heated it up. Freaking JPL. You've already had one, so we're gonna go for her.
Personal, but I hope not too personal. Since you grew up and your dad had a whole bookshelf of science fiction, did he get the opportunity to see your book?
Oh yeah, no, I
on
mean, he's
that
alive.
shelf?
He's still with us. He's very proud. He's very excited.
That's a nice full circle.
Yeah, no, that was awesome. Yeah, no, it's awesome showing the old man, and well, he read it also as I was posting it a chapter at a time, and he really liked it. And then he was just along for the ride as I kept him, I excitedly kept him updated at each step. Oh yeah. How,
Time for two more questions. Gentleman in the back.
yeah, gentleman in the back. Time for 2 more questions.
When you write, do you get more excited about near future or distant future?
I get more excited about near future. First off, because I'm a hard sci-fi guy, so I like to use real technology wherever possible. Near future technology is more predictable, right? I can say like, oh, if we just invented this one thing, if we just made this one little tweak to existing technology somehow, then we could do all this cool stuff. If you go far-flung future, then it starts to become kind of like, oh, well, yeah, we can just assume they invented a thing that does that, assume they invented a thing that does that. And that is also a very fun and entertaining form of science fiction, but it's not the kind of the way that I write it. We got room for one more question. It's a two-parter.
Do you have a favorite sci-fi literary work? And the second question is, what role did film have in igniting your passion for sci-fi and pursuing?
Well, my favorite, if you ask me what's my favorite book on any given day, I'll give different answers, right? But my go-to answer is I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. I really love shared settings, multiple stories that take place in one setting, and I, Robot was fantastic for that. I would like to write more stories that take place in the city of Artemis. So if Artemis is received well, I definitely would plan to make additional books in that. As for film, one of the biggest inspirations for The Martian was, of course, the film Apollo 13 and the real-life events of Apollo 13. That was one of my main inspirations. And for what it's worth, although I know none of you have read it, well, very few of you have read it yet, but weirdly, one of the big inspirations for Artemis, which is about a city on the moon, is the film Chinatown. Chinatown is all about the really ugly stuff that has to happen under the hood for a city to grow. And that's kind of what Artemis is about in a way. I'm not going to spoil. So I believe we're done. Thank you, everybody. I'm sorry I have to leave early, but I'm going to miss your talk, unfortunately. Thank you very much.